What is consciousness? Not thoughts, memories, or personality, but the raw, first-person experience of being. That inner sense of awareness that allows you to know you exist. Despite centuries of philosophy and decades of neuroscience, no one can yet explain how or why it arises. This isn't just a gap in our knowledge, it's a fundamental mystery. Neuroscience has mapped the brain in remarkable detail. We understand how neurons fire, how signals travel, how sensory input is processed. But none of this explains the subjective quality of experience, why electrical activity in the brain should feel like anything at all. Quantum theory, the most accurate framework in physics, tells us that particles can be in multiple states at once, that entangled systems can influence each other instantaneously across vast distances, and that the act of observation seems to shape physical outcomes. Could this strange behavior offer clues to how consciousness works? Tonight, we explore whether consciousness is rooted in quantum mechanics. We trace the development of the idea from its early philosophical origins through modern neuroscience, physics, and biology. Consciousness is the one thing each of us knows directly. We may doubt everything else, the reliability of memory, the accuracy of perception, even the existence of the physical world, but we cannot doubt that we are conscious. The fact that experience happens at all is the most immediate and undeniable feature of human existence. And yet, despite all the advances in science, we still do not know how or why it happens. Modern science has explained an astonishing range of phenomena. We understand the forces that govern galaxies, the structure of atoms, the code of life embedded in DNA, and the complex circuits of the human brain. But consciousness, the very thing that allows us to appreciate those discoveries, remains unexplained. The scientific study of consciousness has long been shaped by two contrasting traditions. One tradition treats the mind as a byproduct of physical processes in the brain. The other holds that subjective experience might require something beyond standard physical explanation. For much of the 20th century, mainstream science focused almost entirely on the first view. By the mid-20th century, neuroscience had become a powerful discipline. With the development of tools like electroencephalography, or EEG, researchers could measure electrical activity in the brain. Later, with technologies such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, scientists could watch different brain regions light up during various tasks. These methods revealed an intricate picture. The brain is an electrical and chemical network of astonishing complexity, with over 80 billion neurons and trillions of connections. From this data, scientists learned a great deal. They could link regions of the brain to specific functions: vision, speech, memory, emotion. They discovered how damage to certain areas could alter perception or personality. The underlying message was clear: the brain creates the mind. This idea gained widespread acceptance. Nobel laureate Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, captured the view bluntly in his later work on the brain. He wrote, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Crick believed that if we could understand the brain's mechanisms in enough detail, we would fully understand consciousness. And yet, as the data accumulated, so did the sense that something was missing. One of the key milestones in this realization came in the 1990s, when Australian philosopher David Chalmers introduced the term the hard problem of consciousness. He distinguished between the easy problems, those that involve explaining behaviors and functions, like how we recognize faces or recall names, and the hard problem, which asks, why is there subjective experience at all? Why doesn't all this brain activity simply happen in the dark, with no inner life attached? The hard problem is not about what the brain does, it is about what experience feels like. Why does the firing of neurons produce a sensation of red, or the taste of coffee, or the feeling of sorrow? And why should a brain, a physical object made of atoms, produce awareness in the first place? This problem struck a nerve. Even scientists who disagreed with Chalmers' conclusions admitted the question was real. Some saw it as a philosophical puzzle. Others began to suspect that the mystery pointed to something deeper, something missing from our scientific framework. Part of the challenge is that consciousness is not something we can observe directly. We can measure brain activity, but we cannot see what someone is experiencing from the inside. Consciousness is private, subjective, and first person. Science, by contrast, is built on objective third-person observation. This mismatch creates a unique tension. Despite this difficulty, researchers pressed forward. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, cognitive scientists and neuroscientists continued mapping the correlations between brain states and mental states. They identified patterns of neural activity associated with attention, intention, and even specific types of dreams. The field of consciousness studies began to take shape, involving a blend of neuroscience, psychology, computer science, and philosophy. Institutions such as the Allen Institute for Brain Science and the Human Connectome Project advanced the detailed mapping of brain networks. Meanwhile, researchers like Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi proposed theoretical models to explain how consciousness might emerge from brain complexity. One of these, integrated information theory, attempted to quantify the degree of consciousness in a system by measuring how much information it integrates across its parts. But even with these advances, no consensus emerged. The gap between neural activity and subjective experience remained stubbornly wide. It was as if science could explain the engine and the machinery, but not why the machine suddenly began to feel like something from the inside. And this raises a deeper question. Could our current scientific tools be fundamentally inadequate for this problem? That's where quantum mechanics enters the story, not as a solution, but as a provocative possibility. Quantum physics is famously strange. It tells us that particles do not have definite properties until they are measured. That entangled particles can influence one another instantly across space. That the act of observation itself seems to play a role in shaping reality. These ideas, though grounded in mathematics and experiment, challenge our classical understanding of cause and effect. In the early days of quantum theory, several physicists wondered whether consciousness might be part of the picture. John von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, and even Erwin Schrodinger speculated on whether the observer's mind played a fundamental role in the outcome of quantum processes. At the time, such ideas were largely philosophical, but as the hard problem of consciousness resurfaced in the late 20th century, some scientists and theorists began to revisit these old questions. Could consciousness itself be a quantum phenomenon? Could the peculiarities of quantum mechanics help explain the mystery of experience? The idea is controversial. Many physicists argue that invoking quantum mechanics to explain consciousness is unnecessary and unsupported. But others believe that consciousness and quantum theory might be deeply connected, that both hint at a more fundamental layer of reality. If consciousness seemed to resist explanation through conventional science, then understanding what that conventional science actually assumed becomes essential. Before quantum mechanics could even enter the conversation, the dominant scientific framework for explaining the mind was rooted in classical physics and computational theory. It shaped decades of neuroscience, psychology, and even artificial intelligence research, and still underpins much of the conversation today. The classical view of consciousness is grounded in a very old idea, that the mind is a machine, and the brain is the hardware that runs it. This perspective evolved in tandem with the rise of classical physics in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers like René Descartes imagined the body as a mechanical system governed by physical laws. Isaac Newton's laws of motion gave a rigorous framework for describing matter in motion, and it was natural to suppose that the human brain, like everything else in the universe, must follow these same rules. Over time, this mechanistic picture of the brain became more refined. In the 19th century, discoveries in electricity and magnetism gave scientists new tools for understanding how the brain might transmit signals. The nervous system, it turned out, operated through electrical impulses. Neurons fired in sequences, much like circuits in a telegraph system. For researchers of the era, this was more than a metaphor. It was a blueprint. By the early 20th century, neurologists had made significant progress in mapping the brain's structure and identifying its functional regions. Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, for example, had already located areas of the brain responsible for speech production and comprehension. Such breakthroughs suggested that the mind could be dissected and understood piece by piece, like any other machine. But it was in the mid-20th century that the idea of the brain as a computational device truly crystallized. The rise of computer science offered a new and powerful metaphor. If computers could take input, process it through logic, and generate output, then perhaps the brain did something similar, only far more complex. This idea gained formal structure through the work of British mathematician Alan Turing. In the 1930s, Turing introduced the concept of a universal machine, a theoretical model that could simulate any computation. Decades later, this idea would be applied to biology. If the brain is a physical system, and if all physical systems follow computable laws, then the brain must be, in principle, a kind of Turing machine. This viewpoint was not limited to philosophers or mathematicians. In the post-war decades, cognitive scientists began to construct models of perception, memory, and language that mirrored computational processes. The mind was often described as software running on the hardware of the brain. This became known as the computational theory of mind, and it remains influential in both neuroscience and artificial intelligence. One of the leading advocates of this approach was the neuroscientist and molecular biologist Francis Crick. After his work on the structure of DNA in the 1950s, Crick turned his attention to the brain. In the 1990s, he published The Astonishing Hypothesis, in which he argued that all aspects of human experience, emotions, memories, even free will, could be explained by the interactions of neurons and molecules. In Crick's words, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." It was a stark view, but for many scientists, it was also an empowering one. If consciousness was the result of computation, then it could eventually be understood, replicated, and perhaps even engineered. This belief fueled much of the early work in artificial intelligence. Pioneers like Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy believed that consciousness, or at least intelligence, could emerge from sufficiently complex algorithms. If the brain was a machine, then the path to understanding consciousness lay in reverse engineering that machine, breaking it down into circuits, pathways, and codes. Meanwhile, neuroscientists pushed forward with mapping the physical architecture of the brain. They discovered that neurons communicate through electrochemical signals at synapses, that different patterns of brainwaves correspond to different states of consciousness, and that brain regions form dynamic networks rather than isolated modules. The tools of classical physics and computation helped clarify these interactions in ever greater detail. The broader implication was clear. The mystery of consciousness would eventually dissolve as more data came in. There was no need for mysterious forces or exotic physics. Just as 19th century chemistry had dissolved the alchemical idea of vital force, modern neuroscience would demystify the mind. This mechanistic confidence extended even into areas of philosophy. A school of thought known as functionalism argued that what matters is not the substance of the system, whether it's made of neurons or silicon, but how it functions. If a machine behaves like a conscious being, processes information like one, and interacts with the world in similar ways, then, for all practical purposes, it is conscious. But this picture, while powerful, left something out. Even as researchers mapped the neural correlates of consciousness, the measurable patterns that accompany awareness, they still could not explain why those patterns gave rise to experience. They could point to what happens in the brain when someone feels pain, but not why that brain state feels painful from the inside. They could identify brain regions involved in visual processing, but not why seeing the color red feels different from seeing the color blue. This is the crux of the so-called explanatory gap. Classical neuroscience could describe the structure and behavior of the brain with increasing precision, but it could not bridge the leap from objective processes to subjective experience. This gap became more pronounced as researchers began working with patients who had unusual neurological conditions. In cases of split brain surgery, for instance, procedures that sever the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres, patients sometimes behaved as if two separate streams of consciousness coexisted within one body. These findings suggested that consciousness might not be a single, unified process, but rather an emergent property of multiple interacting subsystems. Yet even here, the central question remained: why does any configuration of subsystems feel like anything at all? The computational view also faced philosophical challenges. In the 1980s, philosopher John Searle introduced the famous Chinese room argument, which questioned whether symbol manipulation, computation, was sufficient for understanding or consciousness. A machine might process Chinese characters and respond correctly without ever understanding the language. The point was not to deny that machines could simulate understanding, but to argue that simulation is not the same as experience. By the early 21st century, it was clear that neuroscience had made great strides in explaining the mechanics of the mind, but the nature of consciousness remained elusive, and this opened the door, if only slightly, to other possibilities. Perhaps the tools of classical physics and computation, powerful as they were simply not enough. Perhaps consciousness was not something that could be explained entirely in terms of information processing or biological complexity, and perhaps another framework, one that dealt with the fundamentally strange and indeterminate, might offer a different perspective. If the classical model of the brain, grounded in computation and electrochemical activity, struggles to explain consciousness, then perhaps we must look beyond the familiar frameworks of physics itself. That path leads us directly into one of the most successful and puzzling theories in all of science: quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was not invented in a single moment, nor by a single person. It emerged gradually across the late 19th and early 20th centuries as physicists struggled to explain observations that did not fit the well-established laws of classical physics. The first cracks appeared in the late 1800s when Max Planck was investigating blackbody radiation, how objects emit heat. Classical theory predicted that hotter objects should radiate an infinite amount of energy, especially at short wavelengths. This ultraviolet catastrophe clearly did not occur in nature, and Planck proposed a radical solution in 1900. Energy must be emitted in discrete packets, or quanta. Planck's idea was not initially embraced as a revolution, but it planted a seed. A few years later, in 1905, Albert Einstein expanded on the concept when he explained the photoelectric effect, the way light could knock electrons off metal surfaces. Classical wave theory predicted that light's intensity mattered most, but experiments showed that only light above a certain frequency could release electrons, regardless of its intensity. Einstein proposed that light behaves not just as a wave, but also as particles, what we now call photons, each carrying a quantum of energy. These early ideas hinted at a deeper layer of physical reality, one in which the smooth, continuous world of classical physics gave way to something far more granular and strange. In the following decades, this new framework took shape rapidly. Niels Bohr proposed a model of the atom in which electrons occupied discrete orbits, leaping between them by absorbing or emitting specific energy quanta. Werner Heisenberg introduced matrix mechanics, a new kind of mathematics for dealing with quantum systems, and in 1927 he formalized the uncertainty principle. According to Heisenberg, it is fundamentally impossible to know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect accuracy. This was not a limitation of measurement tools, it was a property of nature itself. At nearly the same time, Erwin Schrodinger developed his wave equation, a mathematical formula that describes how quantum systems evolve over time. Instead of picturing particles as tiny objects following precise paths, Schrödinger's equation treats them as wave-like entities spread out across space, existing in a superposition of many possible states simultaneously. This concept, superposition, is one of the central features of quantum mechanics. A quantum system does not occupy a single state, like a classical object. Instead, it exists in a combination of all possible states until it is measured. Once measured, it collapses into a definite outcome. This raised an immediate and profound question. What causes the collapse? According to the dominant interpretation at the time, developed largely by Bohr and known as the Copenhagen interpretation, it is the act of measurement that causes a quantum system to take on a definite state. But what exactly counts as a measurement? Is it the interaction with a measuring device, the involvement of an observer, or something else entirely? This ambiguity troubled many physicists, including Einstein. He famously resisted the idea that reality could be indeterminate, quipping, "God does not play dice with the universe." He believed that quantum mechanics, though successful, must be incomplete. that there existed hidden variables that would eventually restore determinism to physics. Yet experiment after experiment confirmed the predictions of quantum theory. Over the years, the quantum framework only deepened its success. It explained the behavior of atoms, electrons, and light with unprecedented accuracy. It led to the invention of semiconductors, lasers, magnetic resonance imaging, and countless other technologies. The equations worked, the predictions matched reality, but the underlying meaning remained elusive. One of the more peculiar aspects of quantum mechanics is entanglement. When two particles become entangled, their properties become linked, no matter how far apart they are. A measurement on one instantaneously determines the state of the other, even across vast distances. This phenomenon was predicted mathematically and later confirmed in experiments, most notably by physicist Alan Aspect and his team in the 1980s. Entanglement defies classical logic. It suggests that the universe is, in some sense, non-local, that events in one place can instantaneously affect events elsewhere without any signal passing between them. This behavior was deeply unsettling to Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance. Yet it is real, it happens, and no experiment to date has overturned it. Another feature of quantum mechanics is complementarity, the idea that particles can exhibit different properties depending on how they are measured. A classic example is the double-slit experiment. When particles like electrons are fired through two slits toward a screen, they produce an interference pattern, characteristic of waves. But if one attempts to measure which slit an electron goes through, the interference disappears and the pattern becomes that of particles. It is as though the particle knows it is being observed. This experiment, repeated in many variations over the decades, illustrates a crucial point. In the quantum world, the observer seems to play a fundamental role in determining outcomes. This observer dependence lies at the heart of the quantum mystery. In classical physics, observation is passive. Measuring the speed of a baseball does not alter its trajectory in any meaningful way. But in quantum mechanics, the very act of measurement changes the system being observed. That observation might influence reality is not just counterintuitive, it is revolutionary. And it leads naturally to a question that has fascinated scientists and philosophers alike. Could consciousness itself be involved in the process? Some of the early pioneers of quantum theory speculated that it might. John von Neumann, one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the 20th century, argued in the 1930s that no physical system alone could cause wave function collapse. In his view, the chain of measurement, from the quantum particle to the detector to the recording device, must ultimately end in something non-physical. He suggested that consciousness might play that final role. Later, in the 1960s, physicist Eugene Wigner expanded on this idea. He argued that the observer's mind is necessary for a quantum system to become definite. In Wigner's interpretation, consciousness was not just an emergent property of matter, it was an essential participant in the unfolding of physical reality. These ideas were not universally accepted, and many physicists considered them speculative. Still, they raised provocative questions. If consciousness plays a role in quantum processes, then perhaps the brain itself must be understood not merely as a classical machine, but as a quantum system. And if that is true, then our understanding of both physics and consciousness might need to change. Before diving into these more speculative interpretations, it is crucial to understand the specific problem that sparked these discussions in the first place. The phenomenon that challenges the boundary between physics and philosophy most directly is the so-called measurement problem. What exactly happens when a quantum system transitions from a superposition of states to a single definite outcome? To fully grasp the strange link between quantum mechanics and consciousness, we must confront the core paradox at the heart of quantum theory, the measurement problem. It is a puzzle that challenges our most basic assumptions about reality, what it is, when it exists, and what role, if any, the observer plays in defining it. The concept of measurement in classical physics is straightforward. You can measure the speed of a train, the temperature of a star, or the charge of a battery, and in doing so, you simply reveal what was already there. The act of measurement does not disturb the system in any meaningful way. The world is presumed to exist independently of our observation of it. Quantum mechanics upends this assumption. In the quantum world, particles do not have fixed properties until they are measured. Instead, they are described by a mathematical function called the wave function, which represents a superposition, a blend of all possible states the particle could occupy. When we perform a measurement, this wave function appears to collapse, and the particle takes on a definite value, like a specific position or momentum. This behavior is not merely theoretical, it is confirmed by repeated experiments. But what exactly causes the wave function to collapse? And why does it collapse into one particular outcome rather than another? This is the measurement problem. The issue becomes more perplexing when we consider that, according to the standard rules of quantum theory, the evolution of the wave function is governed by deterministic equations, specifically Schrödinger's equation. These equations describe a smooth, predictable unfolding of possibilities over time. Nowhere in these equations is there any mention of collapse. The mathematics does not say when, or even if, the system should reduce to a single state. And yet, when we make a measurement, that is exactly what we observe. The particle is not in a blur of possibilities. It is in one definite state. To account for this, early quantum theorists introduced a dual process. One process, the unitary evolution of the wave function, governs how quantum systems evolve over time when they are not being observed. The other process, collapse, occurs suddenly and discontinuously when a measurement is made. But this left a profound ambiguity. What exactly counts as a measurement? Does a Geiger counter measuring a radioactive particle qualify? What about a computer recording the result? Or is it only when a conscious observer becomes aware of the outcome that the collapse truly occurs? This ambiguity led to various interpretations of quantum mechanics. One of the most influential, the Copenhagen interpretation, proposed by Niels Bohr and his colleagues, argued that quantum properties are not real until they are observed. Bohr emphasized the role of classical measuring devices and believed that trying to describe what happens between measurements was meaningless. In this view, quantum theory does not describe reality itself, but only our knowledge of it. Measurement is an interaction that yields classical outcomes from quantum systems, but it offers no deeper insight into the underlying reality. The observer, in a sense, becomes a participant in determining what is real. This idea was deeply unsettling to many, including Albert Einstein. He rejected the notion that the moon exists only when someone looks at it. He believed that an objective reality must exist independently of observers, and he spent much of his later life searching for a more complete theory. Others, however, took the measurement problem in a very different direction. John von Neumann, in his seminal book, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, published in the early 1930s, analyzed the measurement process in precise mathematical terms. He concluded that if both the quantum system and the measuring apparatus are governed by the same quantum laws, then the act of measurement itself must be described as a quantum interaction. But this leads to an infinite regress. If the system and the measuring device are both quantum, then we must consider the observer's brain as part of the quantum system too. At what point does the wave function collapse? Where does the chain of entanglement end? Von Neumann argued that the collapse must occur outside the physical chain, possibly in the consciousness of the observer. According to this view, mind is not just a byproduct of the physical world. It plays a fundamental role in the way physical reality manifests. Eugene Wigner, a Hungarian-American physicist and Nobel laureate, extended this argument. In the 1960s, he proposed a famous thought experiment known as Wigner's friend. Imagine a laboratory in which Wigner's friend makes a quantum measurement, say, determining whether a particle spins up or down. From the friend's perspective, the result is definite, but from Wigner's perspective outside the lab, the entire system, friend included, remains in a superposition. This leads to a paradox. Can two observers experience different realities? Is the friend's measurement real before Wigner learns the result? And does Wigner's awareness cause a second collapse? The implications are staggering. If consciousness plays a unique role in causing wave function collapse, then consciousness is not merely a product of physics, it is a participant in the fabric of reality. It introduces an element of subjectivity into the heart of the physical world. Of course, not all physicists accept this interpretation. Many view the measurement problem as a sign that quantum mechanics is incomplete, or that we simply do not yet understand how to describe macroscopic measuring devices within a quantum framework. Others have developed alternative interpretations that avoid invoking consciousness altogether. One such alternative is the many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett III in the 1950s. According to this view, the wave function never collapses. Instead, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement actually occur, but in separate branching universes. When you measure a quantum particle, you do not cause it to take on one value. Rather, the universe splits into multiple versions of itself, each containing a different result. In this framework, there is no need for an observer to cause collapse because nothing ever collapses. The wave function evolves deterministically, and the illusion of a single outcome is just the result of our limited perspective. While elegant in its consistency, the many worlds interpretation raises its own difficulties. It demands a nearly infinite proliferation of parallel realities, none of which we can directly observe, and it leaves unresolved the deeper question of why we experience this outcome and not another. Other interpretations, such as decoherence theory, attempt to explain the appearance of collapse without invoking the mind. Decoherence describes how quantum systems lose their quantum properties through interactions with their environment. When a particle becomes entangled with countless other particles, it effectively behaves like a classical object. But decoherence does not actually solve the measurement problem. It explains why quantum effects are not seen in the macroscopic world, but it does not explain why one outcome is experienced rather than another. Amid all these interpretations, the central mystery remains. The observer appears to be indispensable in quantum mechanics, but the theory does not tell us who or what the observer really is. Is observation a physical process like any other, or does it require a conscious mind? And here, the conversation begins to circle back to the topic of consciousness itself. If the mind cannot be reduced to classical computation, and if quantum theory cannot be fully described without reference to observers, then might these two unsolved puzzles be pointing toward the same underlying phenomenon? The notion that consciousness could cause quantum collapse may seem bold, but it is not entirely without precedent. Quantum theory has long challenged our understanding of what is real and when it becomes real, and few thought experiments capture this dilemma more famously or more clearly than Schrödinger's cat. As the debate over the role of observation in quantum mechanics unfolded, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger grew increasingly concerned about what he saw as the theory's philosophical implications. In 1935, in a now legendary paper, Schrödinger presented a simple but haunting scenario. His goal was not to support the idea that observation causes collapse, but rather to highlight the absurdity of that very idea when taken to its logical extreme. Imagine a sealed box containing a cat, a small amount of radioactive material, a Geiger counter, a vial of poison, and a hammer. The setup is designed so that if a single atom decays, the Geiger counter will detect it, triggering the hammer to break the vial and release the poison, killing the cat. If no decay occurs, the cat lives. Radioactive decay is a quantum event. Until it is measured, the atom exists in a superposition of both decayed and not decayed states. By extension, the Geiger counter is also in a superposition of having detected and not detected radiation. The hammer, the poison, and ultimately the cat become entangled in this quantum uncertainty. According to the Copenhagen interpretation, until someone opens the box and makes a measurement, the cat is simultaneously alive and dead. This conclusion defies our everyday experience. It invites an almost surreal image, a cat hovering between life and death until a human observer checks. Schrödinger's point was that the theory, taken at face value, leads to paradox when applied to the macroscopic world. And yet, this is not merely a philosophical game. Schrödinger's cat dramatizes a real issue in quantum theory, the boundary between quantum and classical. At what scale does the wave function collapse? Is it when a particle interacts with a detector, when a biological system reacts, or only when a conscious observer becomes involved? The cat-in-the-box scenario forces us to consider the possibility that reality remains indefinite until observed, and that observation, far from being passive, might be what creates the outcome. This is the essence of the observer effect, the idea that observation is not just a window into reality, but an active player in shaping it. The thought experiment also raises the question of where the line lies between quantum ambiguity and classical definiteness. In the quantum world, particles can be in multiple states, but in our world, cats are either alive or dead. Why is there such a sharp transition, and what defines the boundary? This so-called quantum classical divide remains one of the biggest open questions in physics. Decoherence theory, developed in the late 20th century, offers one partial answer. It describes how quantum systems lose their superposition when they interact with their environment. Through this interaction, the quantum system becomes entangled with so many other particles that interference patterns are lost and classical behavior emerges. In the Schrödinger's cat scenario, decoherence would occur extremely quickly. The interaction between the atom and the Geiger counter, or between the cat and the surrounding molecules, would cause the system to decohere before any human opened the box. From this view, the cat is either alive or dead long before it is observed. But decoherence, while helpful, does not resolve everything. It explains why quantum effects become hidden in large systems, but it does not explain why a specific outcome is experienced. It tells us how a quantum system appears to collapse, but not why this particular result manifests rather than another. The measurement problem, in essence, remains. Schrödinger's cat also serves another purpose. It highlights how deeply quantum uncertainty is entangled with knowledge and information. The system exists in a superposition not because of what is happening inside the box, but because of what we do not know until we look. That has led some physicists and philosophers to suggest that information, and not just matter or energy, may be fundamental to the nature of reality. John Archibald Wheeler, a prominent American physicist and colleague of both Einstein and Bohr, proposed a famous phrase, "it from bit." According to Wheeler, all physical things, the its of the world, ultimately derive their meaning and existence from binary yes or no answers to questions, or bits of information. In this view, reality is not built from matter, but from acts of measurement. Every observation, every quantum interaction, is a kind of question posed to nature, and the answer, yes or no, up or down, brings something into being. This information-centric view dovetails with the idea that the observer plays an essential role in quantum processes. It also invites us to ask whether consciousness is not just another information processor, but something more, something uniquely suited to receive or even generate these fundamental bits of reality. Schrödinger's cat, then, is not just a quirky thought experiment. It is a gateway into the deeper philosophical implications of quantum theory. It forces us to confront the limits of what we can say about reality when no one is looking, and it raises the unsettling possibility that the very act of looking might be what makes reality real. There is also something deeply human in this paradox. We are used to a world where things exist independently of our awareness, where a tree falls in a forest whether or not anyone hears it. But quantum mechanics suggests that, at a fundamental level, the universe may not be so indifferent, that our observation, our consciousness, might play a participatory role in shaping the very structure of events. This is not to say that the mind controls matter or that the observer has magical powers. Rather, it suggests that the act of observation is not separable from the phenomena being observed. In a quantum world, the observer and the observed form an inseparable whole. This idea, while profoundly challenging, does not necessarily imply that consciousness is mystical or beyond science. It may point instead to the need for a new scientific framework, one that includes the observer not as an afterthought, but as a central component. But if the observer is essential, then what kind of observer are we talking about? Is it enough to use a camera or a computer, or does it require something conscious, self-aware, capable of knowing? The implications of Schrödinger's cat were never meant to suggest that the universe hinges on our minds. Yet over time, the strangeness of quantum mechanics continued to invite one compelling question. What if consciousness is not just involved in quantum measurement, but is somehow required for it? From the earliest days of quantum theory, physicists wrestled with this possibility. As we have seen, figures like John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner proposed that consciousness might be the final link in the measurement chain, the entity that turns potential into actuality. This idea, though often resisted by the mainstream, never entirely vanished. It lingered on the edge of theoretical physics and philosophical debate, unresolved and controversial, but never irrelevant. As the 20th century progressed, the problem deepened. The more accurately quantum experiments were performed, the more robust the theory became, and the more puzzling its implications grew. There was no longer any question about whether quantum particles behaved probabilistically. That had been confirmed again and again. What remained unclear was why the probabilities collapsed into certainties only when measured. Could it really be that the presence of a conscious observer resolves the uncertainty? Eugene Wigner certainly thought so. In his writings from the 1960s, Wigner argued that the wave function collapse could not be accounted for by physical systems alone. He noted that if one included the measuring device, the laboratory, and even the experimenter's body as part of the quantum system, the superposition should persist. But when the experimenter becomes aware of the result, it is no longer a superposition. That awareness, he suggested, plays a special role. In Wigner's words, it was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. This was a bold claim. If true, it would mean that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of matter, it is a fundamental part of the machinery of the universe. Yet many physicists were uncomfortable with this conclusion. They worried that it introduced subjectivity into a field that had always aimed for objectivity. If science required consciousness to function, did that not blur the boundary between physical law and personal experience? Still, the question persisted. What is it about consciousness that makes it a candidate for resolving quantum indeterminacy? What separates it from a camera, a clock, or a computer? To answer this, we must consider what consciousness appears to do. It integrates information across time and space. It connects sensory input, memory, emotion, intention, and attention into a unified experience. More importantly, it reflects upon itself. Consciousness knows that it is conscious. This reflexivity, awareness of awareness, is not something we ascribe to ordinary physical systems. And this distinction might offer a clue as to why consciousness seems to play such a unique role in quantum theory. At the same time, the idea that consciousness is tied to quantum mechanics also draws strength from an entirely different direction: the limitations of classical computation. One of the central figures in connecting these threads is Roger Penrose, a British mathematical physicist whose work spans general relativity, cosmology, and quantum gravity. Penrose is best known for his collaborations with Stephen Hawking on black holes and space-time singularities. But in the late 20th century, he turned his attention to consciousness. Penrose did not begin with quantum mechanics. Instead, he began with mathematics. In his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, Penrose argued that human consciousness, particularly our capacity for understanding mathematical truth, cannot be explained by classical computation. He pointed to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any formal mathematical system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. Penrose observed that human mathematicians are able to recognize the truth of such statements, even when they are formally unprovable. He concluded that the human mind must be doing something that goes beyond algorithmic computation. In other words, the brain cannot be a mere computer. But if consciousness is not computational, then what is it? Penrose proposed that the answer might lie in quantum mechanics, but not the standard kind taught in textbooks. He believed that an entirely new type of quantum process, one that bridges the gap between the quantum and classical worlds, might be responsible for conscious experience. This idea led him to develop the concept of objective reduction, or OR. In this framework, quantum superpositions do not require an observer to collapse. Instead, they collapse on their own as a result of gravitational effects. When the difference in space-time curvature between the components of a superposition reaches a certain threshold, nature chooses one outcome over the others. This collapse is not triggered by measurement, but by an objective physical threshold, hence the term objective reduction. But this was only the first half of Penrose's proposal. The second half came when he partnered with Stuart Hameroff, an American anesthesiologist with a background in consciousness and brain biology. Together, Penrose and Hameroff developed a unified theory, orchestrated objective reduction, or Orch OR. They suggested that quantum superpositions occur not just in subatomic particles, but inside the brain itself, specifically within structures called microtubules. These tiny protein assemblies, found in neurons, are involved in maintaining cell shape and supporting intracellular transport. But Hameroff believed they had deeper potential. In the Orch OR model, microtubules support coherent quantum states that evolve and collapse according to Penrose's OR mechanism. These collapses are not random. They are orchestrated by the brain's biological processes and give rise to moments of conscious awareness. In this view, consciousness is not merely the result of neural computation, but of orchestrated quantum events happening deep within the brain. The proposal is radical. It challenges the computational theory of mind. It challenges the view of consciousness as emergent, and it reintroduces the observer into quantum physics, not as a problem, but as a fundamental part of nature. Critics have raised valid objections. Quantum states are notoriously fragile, and the brain is a warm, wet, and noisy environment, not the kind where delicate quantum phenomena are expected to survive. We will explore those criticisms in depth later, but at this stage in our journey, what matters is that the link between consciousness and quantum mechanics had become more than speculation. It had become a formal theory, complete with biological mechanisms, mathematical descriptions, and testable predictions. And at its heart was a simple but profound idea. Consciousness might be the key to resolving the measurement problem, not by stepping outside of physics, but by expanding physics to include processes that were previously overlooked. If this idea is even partially correct, then it changes how we understand both mind and matter. It suggests that the observer is not an afterthought in the story of the universe, but a central character, not a passive spectator, but an active participant in the unfolding of reality. To understand how the Orch OR theory took shape, we must step back and examine its conceptual roots. Long before microtubules entered the picture, Roger Penrose was already challenging the dominant assumptions about the mind and its relationship to physical law. His questions did not begin with biology, but with the limits of mathematics, and from there, his thinking led him to propose one of the most unconventional interpretations of quantum collapse ever put forward. Penrose's central concern was not merely how consciousness works, but whether the known laws of physics and computation could even account for it in principle. He approached this problem from an unusual angle: mathematical logic. In the 1930s, the Austrian logician Kurt Gödel had proved two famous theorems showing that in any sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system, there are truths that cannot be proven within that system. These results shook the foundations of mathematics and had deep philosophical implications. They suggested that no matter how comprehensive a set of formal rules might be, there would always be truths that elude them. Penrose believed that this result had something profound to say about the human mind. He argued that human mathematicians can see the truth of certain Gödel-type statements, even when those truths cannot be derived by any formal system. In other words, the mind appears capable of recognizing truths that no algorithm can produce. If the mind were merely a computer running deterministic algorithms, this should not be possible. This led Penrose to a bold conclusion. The brain must be doing something non-computational. It cannot be explained by classical physics alone, nor by any kind of algorithmic processing, regardless of complexity. But where could non-computational processes come from? Penrose looked to the one part of physics that had not yet been fully understood: quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is the theoretical framework that seeks to unify general relativity, which governs gravity and the structure of space-time, with quantum mechanics, which governs particles and forces at the smallest scales. Despite decades of effort, a complete and experimentally verified theory of quantum gravity does not yet exist. Penrose, however, believed that consciousness might provide a window into this unexplored territory. In his view, the collapse of the quantum wave function is not just a mathematical convenience or the result of measurement, rather, it is a real physical process caused by an instability in space-time geometry when a quantum system exists in a superposition of different states. Each state corresponds to a slightly different curvature of space-time. If the separation between these curvatures exceeds a certain threshold, the superposition becomes unstable and collapses into a definite outcome. Penrose called this process objective reduction, or OR. It is objective because it does not depend on an observer or measurement. It is a built-in feature of the universe. And it is reduction because it reduces a superposed quantum state into a single, definite state. According to Penrose, this process of collapse is neither entirely random nor entirely deterministic. It is influenced by factors within the quantum system, but it is not governed by external measurement. It occurs spontaneously when the gravitational differences between components of the superposition reach a critical level. The idea was revolutionary. It suggested that wave function collapse is not just a matter of epistemology, of what we know, but a real ontological event, something that happens in the physical world regardless of observation. But more importantly, Penrose believed that this objective reduction process might be the missing link in understanding consciousness. In classical neuroscience and in artificial intelligence models, consciousness is seen as emerging from the organization and activity of large-scale neural networks. But these models are fundamentally computational. Penrose argued that if consciousness is rooted in non-computational processes, then it must originate in a place where quantum effects, especially non-computable ones, could play a role. That line of reasoning led him to the brain. But instead of focusing on neurons and synapses, which had been extensively studied, Penrose wondered whether there might be finer structures within brain cells that could support quantum coherence. He suspected that the answer might lie not at the level of whole neurons, but at the subcellular scale, somewhere deeper, smaller, and perhaps more protected from the disruptive noise of biological processes. Around this time, Penrose came into contact with Stuart Hameroff, a practicing anesthesiologist and researcher interested in the biological basis of consciousness. Hameroff had long believed that conventional neuroscience overlooked the importance of the cell's internal architecture, particularly the cytoskeleton. Among the components of the cytoskeleton, one structure stood out: microtubules. Microtubules are cylindrical polymers made of tubulin proteins. They form part of the scaffolding inside cells and are involved in a range of essential functions, from maintaining cell shape to facilitating transport within the cell. In neurons, microtubules extend along axons and dendrites, helping to organize signaling pathways. But Hameroff believed they might be doing something more. Microtubules have a highly ordered lattice structure. The repeating patterns of tubulin dimers create a regular, quasi-crystalline environment that some theorists believe could support quantum coherence under the right conditions. Hameroff suggested that tubulin subunits could exist in quantum superpositions and that these superpositions could be orchestrated, coherently synchronized, across networks of microtubules within neurons. This idea aligned perfectly with Penrose's objective reduction theory. If coherent quantum states could form within microtubules, then objective reductions might occur spontaneously within the brain, and these events, Penrose and Hameroff proposed, could correspond to discrete moments of conscious awareness. Thus was born the Orch OR theory, orchestrated objective reduction. According to this theory, consciousness is not the result of computation or neural signaling alone. Instead, it arises from orchestrated patterns of quantum collapse occurring in the structured environment of neuronal microtubules. Each collapse represents a moment of awareness, and the brain's biological systems serve to regulate and synchronize these collapses in ways that correspond to our thoughts, perceptions, and experiences. The theory is radical in every sense. It posits that consciousness is not only quantum in nature, but that it originates from quantum gravitational processes that have not yet been observed directly. It shifts the locus of consciousness from neural networks to subcellular structures, and it bridges one of the biggest gaps in modern science by linking the hard problem of consciousness to one of the most mysterious areas of physics, the unification of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Critics have pointed out that the theory depends on quantum coherence in biological systems, something that was once thought impossible due to the decoherence effects of thermal noise. Yet even as these criticisms were raised, evidence was emerging that quantum coherence does exist in certain biological systems, including photosynthesis and avian navigation. For Penrose and Hameroff, these findings strengthened the plausibility of their proposal. While the full Orch OR model remains controversial, it has inspired new avenues of research at the intersection of physics, biology, and consciousness studies. At the core of Penrose's thinking lies a powerful idea that consciousness is not an illusion, not a mere byproduct of complexity, but a window into the fundamental nature of reality. It may arise not from the structures we can see under a microscope, but from the hidden geometry of space-time itself. With the conceptual foundation of objective reduction in place and the tantalizing possibility that microtubules might serve as the biological stage for quantum events, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff moved forward to develop a fully articulated theory that attempted to explain consciousness not as an emergent property of neural computation, but as a direct consequence of orchestrated quantum processes in the brain. The result of their collaboration was Orch OR, short for Orchestrated Objective Reduction. It was a bold synthesis of physics, biology, and cognitive science, a theory that attempted to unify the subatomic world with the most intimate aspect of human experience, awareness. At the heart of Orch OR lies a specific proposal: quantum coherence, a delicate state where particles exist in multiple, interdependent conditions, is thought to occur within the brain's microtubules. These microtubules are not peripheral components of neurons. They are integral parts of the cell's internal architecture, forming cylindrical scaffolds that guide a wide array of cellular functions. In neurons, they are especially abundant and structurally organized, extending throughout the axons and dendrites that connect the brain's trillions of synaptic junctions. Hameroff had been studying microtubules for years before meeting Penrose. He was particularly intrigued by their regular lattice structure, composed of repeating units of tubulin, a protein dimer that can exist in different conformational states. He hypothesized that these conformational states could act as quantum bits, or qubits, analogous to those used in quantum computing. Qubits, unlike classical bits, can exist in superpositions, enabling parallel processing on an immense scale. This idea was provocative because it suggested that the brain could perform quantum computations. But the Orch OR theory went further. It proposed that these quantum computations do not simply process information. Instead, they evolve toward a threshold determined by Penrose's objective reduction mechanism. When the gravitational differences between competing quantum states exceed a critical limit, the superposition collapses, not randomly, but in a way influenced by the underlying quantum information. This collapse is what Penrose and Hameroff identified as a moment of conscious awareness. According to Orch OR, consciousness is not continuous. It unfolds in discrete events, brief pulses of awareness occurring many times per second. These events are orchestrated, not only in timing but in content, by the structure and dynamics of the microtubules and their interactions with the surrounding neural systems. In other words, consciousness arises not from neurons firing in sequence, but from quantum computations happening inside those neurons, synchronized and collapsed in a way that creates a coherent experience of now. This model diverges sharply from the classical computational theory of mind. It does not rely on traditional algorithms or synaptic networks alone. Instead, it introduces a fundamentally different kind of information processing, one that is not just non-computational, but rooted in space-time geometry and quantum gravity. Critics have understandably challenged the feasibility of this proposal. The most immediate concern is decoherence, the tendency for quantum states to collapse when they interact with their environment. The brain, being warm, wet and full of chaotic activity, seems like a hostile place for fragile quantum states. In standard physics, maintaining quantum coherence in such an environment is considered nearly impossible without extreme isolation and low temperatures. Penrose and Hameroff, however, pointed to emerging evidence that nature may have found ways to overcome these limitations. In particular, they highlighted research in quantum biology, a field that has demonstrated coherent quantum processes in living systems once believed too thermally noisy for such behavior. For example, studies in photosynthesis have shown that energy transfer in certain plant and bacterial systems involves coherent quantum wave-like motion. This allows energy to find its most efficient path to the reaction center, a phenomenon that classical physics alone cannot explain. Similarly, research into avian magnetoreception suggests that birds use entangled electrons in proteins called cryptochromes to sense Earth's magnetic field during navigation. These findings have shifted the conversation. If delicate quantum processes can exist in biological systems, perhaps the brain is not as inhospitable to quantum coherence as once believed. Hameroff argued that the interior of microtubules might provide a shielded environment suitable for quantum states, especially if aided by quantum error correction mechanisms and ordered water structures lining the tubulin lattice. Furthermore, the theory proposed that quantum coherence in the brain does not need to last indefinitely. Even brief coherence, on the order of milliseconds, could be sufficient for orchestrated objective reduction to occur and generate conscious moments. One of the strengths of Orch OR is that it makes testable predictions. Penrose and Hameroff suggested specific timings for conscious events based on the energy scale of gravitational-induced collapse. They also proposed that anesthesia, which disrupts consciousness, may act by interfering with microtubule dynamics, offering a potential way to experimentally validate the theory. Indeed, anesthetics are known to interact with the lipid environment of cell membranes, but Hameroff proposed that they also bind directly to tubulin, altering its quantum behavior. This idea would later inspire experimental investigations aimed at determining whether microtubules are involved in the onset and reversal of anesthesia. Despite these testable implications, the Orch OR theory remains highly controversial. Most neuroscientists remain unconvinced that quantum processes play a functional role in cognition, and many quantum physicists question whether objective reduction is physically well defined. The theory exists at the intersection of fields that often do not speak the same language, and this, in part, has made it difficult to evaluate on purely empirical grounds. Still, what cannot be ignored is that Orch OR attempts to do something most other theories of consciousness do not. It confronts the hard problem directly. It does not reduce consciousness to computation or dismiss it as an illusion. Instead, it treats consciousness as an intrinsic, irreducible aspect of physical reality, one that emerges not from complexity alone, but from fundamental interactions at the quantum gravitational level. It also offers a potential answer to why consciousness feels unified. In classical neural networks, information is processed in parallel across many modules, but that does not explain why experience seems to coalesce into a single, seamless whole. In Orch OR, the collapse of a coherent quantum state, containing entangled information from across the brain, could account for this unity. Moreover, Orch OR suggests that consciousness is not just a property of biological systems, but a process that taps into the deep structure of the universe. This carries metaphysical implications, of course, but it also invites scientific exploration into the possibility that conscious experience is a fundamental component of nature, not unlike mass, charge, or spin. Whether or not Orch OR is correct, its significance lies in the fact that it connects two of the most mysterious domains in science, consciousness and quantum mechanics. It proposes that the link between them is not incidental, but essential. To assess whether Orch OR offers a plausible account of consciousness, we must take a closer look at the specific structures it places at the center of this quantum biological bridge, microtubules. These tiny cylindrical scaffolds, once thought to serve only structural and transport roles inside the cell, have become central to a bold hypothesis that they are quantum computers operating deep within the architecture of the brain. Microtubules are composed of tubulin dimers, pairs of alpha and beta tubulin proteins that assemble into hollow tubes with a diameter of about 25 nanometers. Each tubulin dimer acts like a modular building block, and thousands of them line up to form long, hollow cylinders that span the internal spaces of the cell. Within neurons, microtubules are particularly well developed. They extend throughout axons and dendrites, guiding the growth and maintenance of the neuron's vast, branching network of connections. From a classical biological perspective, the importance of microtubules is undeniable. They are essential for cell division, intracellular transport, and maintaining the shape and polarity of neurons. They also play a critical role in the migration of developing neurons and in organizing the synaptic architecture that underpins learning and memory. But Stuart Hameroff, who had been studying microtubules as an anesthesiologist, saw something more. He proposed that tubulin proteins could switch between different states, somewhat like binary units, but with the added possibility of occupying quantum superpositions of those states. In this view, tubulin dimers are not merely structural units. They are quantum elements capable of storing and processing information across coherent quantum states. This is a bold claim, and it raises several important questions. First, what physical evidence suggests that microtubules are suitable for quantum computation? Second, how might these structures protect quantum coherence in a warm, noisy biological environment? And third, do microtubules show behavior that is qualitatively different from what we would expect if they were merely classical components? Let us begin with the structural basis. Microtubules are not random or amorphous. They exhibit a highly ordered helical lattice structure. This geometric regularity is thought to create a form of symmetry that could help shield quantum states from decoherence. In particular, the hydrophobic pockets within tubulin proteins, regions that repel water, could create quantum-friendly zones where the influence of thermal noise is reduced. These pockets might allow for coherent dipole oscillations, a key ingredient in sustaining quantum entanglement. Furthermore, the interior of microtubules is filled with structured water, a form of water whose molecules align in a more ordered pattern than typical bulk water. Some researchers believe that this structured water could help isolate quantum states, supporting coherence through a kind of quantum shielding. While this remains a matter of ongoing investigation, it introduces a possible mechanism by which biology might maintain quantum conditions longer than previously thought possible. The second important consideration is functionality. If microtubules truly support quantum coherence, we would expect them to demonstrate some form of organized behavior that exceeds the predictions of classical biology. Indeed, some studies have suggested that microtubules exhibit properties consistent with electrical oscillations and signal propagation, not just mechanical support. In the early 2000s, Japanese physicist Masatoshi Jibu and his collaborators proposed models in which quantum vibrations in microtubules could propagate through networks of neurons. These vibrations might create coherent wave patterns that synchronize across regions of the brain, perhaps even coordinating the orchestration required in Orch OR. Subsequent work by Indian physicist Anirban Bandyopadhyay added experimental weight to these ideas. In a series of studies beginning in the mid-2000s, Bandyopadhyay's team used sophisticated nanoscale probing techniques to measure oscillatory activity in isolated microtubules. What they found surprised many. Microtubules exhibited resonant frequencies in the megahertz to gigahertz range, far faster than traditional neural activity. These ultra-fast vibrations, if verified and replicated, might provide a physical substrate for quantum processing. They could allow for rapid information integration within a single neuron, and potentially across networks of neurons. According to Orch OR, it is this integration, coordinated across space and time and governed by Penrose's objective reduction, that gives rise to conscious moments. But the leap from observed vibrations to consciousness is a large one. Not everyone in the scientific community agrees that the evidence supports the claims made by Hameroff and Penrose. Critics argue that while microtubules may play electrical or regulatory roles in neurons, these behaviors do not require quantum mechanics to explain. Others suggest that observed resonances could be artifacts of measurement, or that coherence, even if present, might not be sustained long enough to contribute meaningfully to cognition. Still, there are reasons not to dismiss the possibility. As mentioned previously, nature has found ways to exploit quantum phenomena in environments that are not traditionally considered quantum-friendly. In the process of photosynthesis, for example, certain protein complexes guide energy transfer with near-perfect efficiency, an effect best explained through quantum coherence. If plants can maintain such precision, is it unreasonable to think that evolution might have developed similar mechanisms in animals, particularly in the organ as complex and energy-hungry as the brain? Moreover, there are functional reasons for the brain to evolve such a capability. The human brain operates with remarkable efficiency, using only about 20 watts of power to perform tasks that remain out of reach for even the most advanced computers. Quantum processing, if it exists in the brain, could offer a level of parallelism and integration that classical computation cannot match. From this perspective, microtubules may not just be passive structural supports or transport tracks. They may be deeply involved in the timing, coherence, and perhaps even the generation of subjective experience. Supporting this view, researchers have found that microtubules are not evenly distributed throughout the neuron, but are especially concentrated in areas near synapses, where they may influence the strength and timing of neural firing. Some studies suggest that microtubules can modulate synaptic activity through calcium signaling and protein trafficking, functions closely tied to memory and learning. If microtubules indeed play a dynamic role in synaptic regulation, and if they are capable of supporting quantum coherence, then the line between classical and quantum processing in the brain may not be so clear. It is conceivable that classical signals, such as electrical impulses along axons, could be shaped or even initiated by quantum events happening at the subcellular level. The implications are profound. They suggest a nested model of brain function, with classical neural networks on the surface and quantum processes occurring in the depths. Consciousness, in this model, is not simply the output of neurons, but the product of a deeper layer of reality, a layer governed by the strange, beautiful laws of quantum physics. Of course, this is still a theory in development. The evidence, while suggestive, remains incomplete. The experimental challenges are immense. Measuring quantum states inside living cells is extraordinarily difficult, and isolating the role of microtubules in consciousness is even more so. Yet the theory has sparked new lines of inquiry. It has drawn attention to structures once overlooked in neuroscience. It has encouraged collaboration between physicists, biologists, and consciousness researchers. And it has reminded the scientific community that some of the most basic questions, what is the mind and how does it arise, may require thinking far beyond conventional boundaries. If microtubules within neurons are truly capable of supporting quantum processes, it is worth asking whether such behavior is unique to the brain, or whether it might be part of a broader biological principle. In recent decades, a surprising number of discoveries have emerged from the growing field of quantum biology, a discipline that explores how living organisms might be using the strange laws of quantum mechanics to carry out life's most fundamental tasks. For much of the 20th century, the idea that quantum mechanics could play a significant role in biology was viewed with skepticism. After all, quantum phenomena, such as superposition, entanglement and tunneling, were believed to occur only in highly controlled environments, cryogenic temperatures, isolated vacuum chambers, or in the carefully tuned architecture of quantum computers. Biology, by contrast, is messy. It operates at body temperature, in fluid environments, surrounded by constant molecular noise. Yet nature has repeatedly demonstrated a capacity for exploiting physical laws in surprising and efficient ways. And beginning in the early 2000s, scientists began to uncover evidence that certain biological systems not only tolerate quantum effects, but seem to rely on them. One of the first and most striking examples came from the study of photosynthesis. In photosynthetic organisms, such as plants, algae, and certain bacteria, sunlight is captured by pigment protein complexes and converted into chemical energy. The process begins when a photon of light excites an electron, creating an energy packet known as an exciton. This exciton must then travel through a network of molecules to reach the reaction center, where the energy is stored in chemical bonds. Classical physics would suggest that the exciton should take a random walk, bouncing from molecule to molecule until it eventually reaches its destination. But this kind of diffusive transport is inefficient and slow. Yet experiments showed that energy transfer in these systems is astonishingly fast and efficient, nearly 100% in some cases. In 2007, a research team led by physicists Graham Fleming and Greg Engel used a technique called two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy to observe energy flow within the Fenner-Matthews-Olson complex, a photosynthetic protein found in green sulfur bacteria. What they discovered stunned the scientific community. The excitons appeared to explore all possible paths simultaneously, as though the system were using quantum superposition to sample multiple routes at once. This allowed the energy to find the most efficient path, not by trial and error, but by a kind of quantum optimization. This discovery demonstrated that quantum coherence, the simultaneous existence of multiple states, could persist in a warm, wet biological system for surprisingly long durations, on the order of hundreds of femtoseconds. While brief, these timescales are more than sufficient for molecular processes like energy transfer. It was the first clear indication that quantum mechanics could play a functional role in biology. Following this breakthrough, researchers began to look for quantum effects in other systems. One of the most compelling candidates was avian magnetoreception, the ability of migratory birds to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. For decades, scientists puzzled over how birds could detect such weak magnetic fields with such precision. One hypothesis involved magnetite crystals in their beaks, but this did not fully explain the sensitivity or consistency of their navigation. An alternative hypothesis, developed in the late 20th century and supported by growing evidence, centers on cryptochromes, light-sensitive proteins found in the eyes of birds and many other animals. These proteins are thought to generate pairs of entangled electrons when exposed to blue light. The spins of these electrons are influenced by Earth's magnetic field, and the resulting chemical changes provide directional information to the bird. This process would require the entangled electron pair to remain coherent long enough to influence the chemical outcome, an extraordinary claim given the thermal noise inside a living cell. Yet experiments have supported the idea. In 2021, a team led by Thorsten Ritz and colleagues provided direct evidence of magnetic sensitivity in cryptochromes, suggesting that quantum entanglement plays a key role in avian navigation. If confirmed, this would represent a second major instance in which life appears to depend on quantum coherence to perform a complex task, one involving sensory perception and behavior. Another fascinating area of research involves the sense of smell. Traditional theories of olfaction suggested that odorant molecules fit into receptors like keys into locks, with shape determining the match. But this explanation has trouble accounting for why molecules with nearly identical shapes can smell entirely different, and why different shapes can sometimes produce the same scent. A competing theory, proposed by biophysicist Luca Turin, suggests that smell may involve quantum tunneling. According to this idea, odorant molecules trigger receptor responses, not by shape alone, but by allowing electrons to tunnel across a barrier within the receptor. This process depends on the vibrational frequency of the molecule, meaning that smell may be more about vibration than geometry. Though still debated, experiments have offered tentative support for this vibrational theory of smell. For example, animals trained to distinguish between odorant molecules with similar shapes but different vibrational spectra have shown the ability to tell them apart, a result not easily explained by the lock and key model alone. Together, these examples form an intriguing pattern. In photosynthesis, magnetoreception, and possibly olfaction, quantum processes appear to provide specific advantages, greater efficiency, sensitivity, or discrimination. In each case, biological evolution seems to have harnessed phenomena that, until recently, were believed to belong only to the domain of physics labs and quantum devices. This challenges the assumption that quantum coherence is too fragile for life. On the contrary, it suggests that life may be uniquely suited to working with quantum rules, perhaps even optimized for it. What does this mean for the brain? It provides a form of precedent. If nature can sustain coherence in protein complexes involved in light capture and navigation, then the idea that microtubules could support quantum states is no longer implausible by default. The brain, far from being an exception, may be another example of biology using quantum phenomena to perform functions that classical mechanisms cannot fully explain. Moreover, the brain is a uniquely demanding organ. It is metabolically expensive, consuming a disproportionate share of the body's energy. It operates at high speed and with remarkable parallelism, and it generates a unified field of conscious experience from a distributed network of cells. These challenges could, in theory, benefit from quantum processes. Coherence could help synchronize distant regions of the brain. Entanglement might allow for instantaneous integration of information, and quantum collapse, as proposed in Orch OR, could provide the mechanism by which scattered neural activity coalesces into conscious moments. To be clear, the presence of quantum effects in other biological systems does not prove that consciousness is quantum, but it does strengthen the plausibility of the hypothesis. It shows that biology can support coherence, can shield quantum states, and can benefit from the properties of quantum mechanics in ways that classical physics cannot easily replicate. This growing body of evidence has inspired new efforts to investigate whether quantum phenomena are active in the brain and whether they are essential to consciousness. It has also challenged researchers to develop tools and experiments capable of detecting and manipulating quantum states inside living cells. We are only at the beginning of this exploration. The science is still young, the measurements are difficult, and the theories are evolving. But what is becoming increasingly clear is that life itself may be more quantum than we ever imagined. While the growing body of evidence from quantum biology has opened new possibilities for understanding consciousness, it has also intensified debate. As intriguing as theories like Orch OR may be, many scientists remain deeply skeptical. They argue that such ideas are not only speculative, but perhaps unnecessary, and that invoking quantum mechanics to explain consciousness may be solving one mystery by introducing another. To fairly evaluate the quantum approach, we must understand the strongest objections it faces. These critiques come from various disciplines: neuroscience, quantum physics, computer science, and philosophy. Each challenges a different aspect of the quantum consciousness hypothesis, from its biological feasibility to its mathematical coherence to its scientific necessity. One of the most consistent and forceful objections centers on the issue of decoherence. As described in previous sections, quantum states are notoriously delicate. In laboratory settings, maintaining quantum coherence requires extreme measures: cryogenic temperatures, vacuum isolation, and shielding from even the tiniest environmental interactions. The warm, noisy, dynamic environment of the brain seems like the exact opposite of such conditions. Physicist Max Tegmark addressed this issue directly in a paper published in the late 1990s. He calculated the decoherence timescales for quantum states in the brain, including those potentially occurring within microtubules. His conclusion was stark. Under biological conditions, decoherence would occur far too quickly, on the order of femtoseconds, for any meaningful quantum processing to occur. In other words, the quantum states would collapse due to environmental interference long before they could be orchestrated into the kind of patterns required by the Orch OR model. Tegmark's work is often cited as a decisive blow against quantum consciousness theories, suggesting that even if microtubules have some unusual properties, they cannot sustain quantum coherence long enough to matter. Penrose and Hameroff responded by challenging Tegmark's assumptions. They argued that his model did not take into account the actual structure and environment of microtubules, including the possibility of shielding by ordered water and internal symmetries that could slow decoherence. They also questioned whether quantum error correction, a process by which coherent states can be maintained through self-stabilizing patterns, might be operating in biological systems. Still, the decoherence problem remains unresolved. Without empirical evidence that quantum coherence can last long enough inside the brain, any theory based on such coherence remains speculative. Another major criticism focuses on the lack of direct evidence. While Orch OR is theoretically detailed and draws on real biological structures, no experiment to date has conclusively demonstrated that consciousness is caused by quantum processes. The presence of microtubules in neurons, even if they exhibit electrical or vibrational properties, does not prove that they engage in quantum computation, nor does it establish a link between those processes and the subjective experience of awareness. In neuroscience, progress has been made without reference to quantum mechanics. Researchers have mapped patterns of activity associated with perception, intention, memory, and emotion. Studies in brain imaging and neurophysiology have revealed consistent neural correlates of consciousness. Although these do not solve the hard problem, they do support a model in which consciousness correlates with large-scale neural dynamics, not with subatomic events. From this perspective, quantum theories may be viewed as unnecessary. They introduce complexity without yielding clearer predictions or explanations. Philosopher Daniel Dennett, for instance, has argued that invoking quantum mechanics in theories of mind is a kind of magical thinking, a placeholder for gaps in current understanding. He insists that consciousness, however puzzling, must ultimately be explained in terms of evolutionary biology and computational neuroscience. Other critics come from the domain of quantum physics itself. Many physicists dispute the idea that quantum mechanics requires a conscious observer. According to interpretations such as decoherence theory and many worlds, wave function collapse is either apparent rather than real or unnecessary altogether. These views maintain that measurement does not require an observer in the traditional sense, certainly not a conscious one. In these models, quantum systems interact with their environments in ways that effectively eliminate superposition without invoking awareness. Once a system becomes entangled with countless other degrees of freedom, like molecules in the air, photons of light, or vibrations in a surrounding medium, it rapidly decoheres. The result looks like classical behavior, even though the underlying process remains quantum. Proponents of these interpretations argue that quantum mechanics should not be used to explain consciousness because quantum theory itself does not depend on consciousness. From this vantage point, Orch OR reverses the explanatory arrow, using one mystery to explain another without resolving either. Critics also highlight the difficulty of falsification. For a theory to be scientific, it must make testable predictions that can, in principle, be proven wrong. Many argue that Orch OR does not yet meet this standard. While it makes some timing predictions and suggests mechanisms that could be tested, these tests have not yet yielded decisive results. Until it can be clearly distinguished from competing models by empirical means, it remains a hypothesis without experimental confirmation. Skeptics also point out that classical models of consciousness continue to advance. For instance, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, and other frameworks have generated fruitful research and made predictions that align with observed brain dynamics. These models explain how consciousness might arise from the interaction of large-scale neural networks without appealing to quantum mechanics. Moreover, modern artificial intelligence systems, though not conscious in any human sense, have achieved remarkable feats using entirely classical computation. Language models, image recognition systems, and decision-making algorithms all operate without the benefit of quantum coherence. If consciousness requires quantum processes, why are these classical systems so effective at mimicking elements of cognition? Of course, Orch OR does not claim that classical processes are irrelevant. It suggests that quantum events operate in tandem with classical neural activity. But to many, this dual-level explanation complicates rather than clarifies the picture. There is also the issue of philosophical overreach. Some versions of quantum consciousness theory veer toward metaphysics, suggesting that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe. While this idea, related to Panpsychism, has historical roots and modern defenders, it is not easily testable. Critics worry that such speculation blurs the line between science and philosophy and may hinder progress by shifting focus away from measurable phenomena, yet it would be premature to dismiss quantum consciousness theories outright. Science is filled with ideas that seemed implausible at first, but gained traction as tools and data improved. Plate tectonics, heliocentrism, and quantum theory itself were all once considered fringe. The fact that Orch OR remains unproven does not mean it is wrong, but it does mean that it must be held to high standards of scrutiny and evidence. And there are signs of progress. Experimental techniques are becoming more refined. Advances in nanotechnology, cryo-electron microscopy, and biophysics may eventually allow scientists to detect quantum coherence in real time inside living cells. Efforts are underway to study how anesthetics interact with microtubules, a line of inquiry that could shed light on whether consciousness and microtubule activity are meaningfully linked. In this sense, the criticism itself is productive. It forces theories like Orch OR to clarify their assumptions, refine their predictions, and propose new experiments. It keeps the conversation grounded in scientific method, even as it explores the outer edges of what is currently known, and that may be the most important point. The study of consciousness is not a finished field. It is a frontier, rich with mystery and possibility. The debates surrounding quantum models are part of a broader struggle to understand how subjective experience arises in a physical world, while quantum consciousness theories such as Orch OR attempt to ground awareness in the physics of space-time and the behavior of quantum systems. There are competing frameworks that take a fundamentally different route, models that reject the need for quantum mechanics altogether and instead look for answers in the structure and flow of information itself. One of the most prominent and rigorously developed among these is integrated information theory, often abbreviated as IIT. Integrated information theory does not begin with neurons, microtubules, or quantum fields. It begins with a question: what kind of system has conscious experience, and how can we measure the amount and quality of that experience? In other words, rather than trying to explain consciousness by reducing it to physical mechanisms, IIT tries to reverse engineer the phenomenon, starting from what consciousness is like and working backward to infer the kinds of systems that could generate it. This approach is based on a few foundational observations. First, conscious experience is integrated. When you see a red apple, you do not experience its color, shape, and location as separate sensations. You perceive them as a unified whole. Second, consciousness is informative. Each moment of awareness excludes countless other possible experiences, representing a specific state among many alternatives. These two properties, integration and information, form the basis of IIT. The theory was originally formulated by Italian neuroscientist Giulio Tononi in the early 2000s. Tononi proposed that any system capable of generating consciousness must possess a certain level of phi, a mathematical quantity that represents the degree to which the system integrates information. The higher the value of phi, the more conscious the system is said to be. Phi is not merely a measure of complexity or connectivity. It reflects how irreducible the system is to its parts. For example, a digital camera might contain millions of light sensors, but if each pixel operates independently, the system as a whole does not integrate information. It processes it in parallel but not as a unified whole. According to IIT, such a system would not be conscious, no matter how many components it has. By contrast, the human brain integrates information across multiple levels and timescales. Neural signals are not only processed locally, but shared across widespread networks. Patterns of activity in one region influence and are influenced by activity elsewhere. This bidirectional flow creates a system where the whole is more than the sum of its parts, a key requirement for high phi. One of the strengths of IIT is that it offers a formal framework for measuring consciousness. It defines mathematical procedures to determine the degree of integration within a system, although calculating phi precisely for complex systems like the human brain remains computationally challenging. Nevertheless, researchers have used approximations of phi to study consciousness in various contexts, including sleep, anesthesia, and brain injury. For example, studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation combined with EEG recording have shown that when the brain is awake, stimulation triggers complex, sustained responses across multiple regions, a signature of high integration. Under general anesthesia or in deep sleep, these responses become simpler and more localized, indicating lower levels of integrated information. This correlation between phi-like measures and states of consciousness lends support to the theory. IIT also addresses the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why and how subjective experience arises. Tononi's answer is both bold and elegant. Consciousness is what integrated information feels like from the inside. In this view, consciousness is not something that emerges from physical processes as a side effect. It is identical to the causal structure of a system that integrates information in a specific way. This leads to a striking conclusion. Consciousness is a fundamental property of certain kinds of systems. It is not restricted to humans or even to biological organisms. Any system with sufficient integration may have some level of experience, however simple or unfamiliar it may be. This claim has both philosophical appeal and scientific implications. It implies that consciousness is not binary, but graded, existing in degrees across a spectrum. A dog may have more consciousness than a lizard more than a bee, and a bee more than a thermostat. Even within the human brain, different regions may contribute to consciousness in varying degrees depending on how integrated they are with the rest of the system. But IIT does not suggest that everything is conscious. A rock, for instance, may have many parts, but if they do not interact in a structured, integrated way, the system has no phi and no experience. What matters is not complexity alone, but how the components are causally connected. This framework opens the door to evaluating consciousness in artificial systems as well. If a computer or robot were designed in such a way that its internal architecture supported high integration of information, IIT would predict that it possesses some form of consciousness. The theory thus provides a potential test for machine awareness, one based not on behavior but on internal structure. At the same time, this raises ethical and philosophical questions. If a system with high phi has conscious experience, then could some of today's machines, highly connected information processing devices, have some minimal form of consciousness? What about neural networks trained to recognize images or generate language? Even if their behavior seems intelligent, does their architecture support the kind of integration that IIT requires? This line of inquiry highlights both the promise and the controversy of the theory. IIT has also been criticized on several fronts. One major concern is practicality. Calculating phi for real-world systems is extremely difficult. The number of interactions in even a small network of components grows exponentially, making exact measurement of integration computationally intractable beyond a few elements. As a result, much of the empirical work relies on simplified or approximate measures. Another criticism concerns falsifiability. Although IIT makes clear predictions about the conditions under which consciousness should or should not be present, some argue that these predictions are too abstract or too difficult to test with current technology. For instance, how do we validate claims about consciousness in a system we cannot interrogate subjectively? Some neuroscientists also question whether the theory aligns with what we know about the brain. While IIT identifies integration as a key feature of consciousness, integration also occurs in systems that are not conscious, such as complex control systems or artificial neural networks. Critics ask whether the presence of integration is sufficient or merely necessary for consciousness. Others challenge the theory's ontological claims. IIT implies that consciousness is an intrinsic property of certain physical systems, a view some compare to Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a basic feature of the universe. While IIT does not go that far, it does suggest that consciousness is not limited to biological systems, and that it arises from causal structure, not from specific materials. In this sense, IIT offers a radical departure from both classical neuroscience and quantum models. It does not appeal to exotic physics or subcellular mechanisms. It does not require wave function collapse or gravitational thresholds. It proposes instead that consciousness is a product of information and its integration, measurable in principle and grounded in causality. Despite the challenges, IIT has inspired a significant body of research and experimentation. It has influenced discussions on the nature of awareness, the architecture of artificial intelligence, and the ethics of sentient machines. It has also contributed to the broader effort to bridge subjective experience with objective science. In some ways, IIT and quantum theories of consciousness represent opposite ends of a conceptual spectrum. One is grounded in physics, the other in information. One emphasizes the mysterious and unresolved, the other seeks clarity through formal structure. Yet both attempt to do the same thing, to explain how and why consciousness arises in the universe. As the investigation into consciousness progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that any serious theory must engage with the concept of computation, what it means to process information, how systems encode and transform data, and whether such processes can give rise to awareness. While integrated information theory centers this question around the structure of information and its integration, a different but related inquiry asks whether consciousness might arise through a special kind of computation, one that is inherently quantum in nature. To explore this idea, we must first understand the distinction between classical and quantum computation. Classical computers, which power everything from smartphones to supercomputers, process information in binary form. Each bit in a classical system holds a value of either 0 or 1. These bits are manipulated using logical gates that follow deterministic rules, and the outcome of any computation is entirely determined by the input and the operations performed. Quantum computers, by contrast, rely on qubits, quantum bits that can exist in a superposition of both 0 and 1 simultaneously. When multiple qubits are entangled, their combined state cannot be described independently. This allows quantum systems to encode and process a vast amount of information in parallel, leveraging phenomena like superposition and entanglement to perform computations that are fundamentally different from what classical machines can achieve. The theoretical foundations of quantum computing were laid in the latter half of the 20th century by pioneers such as Richard Feynman, David Deutsch, and Peter Shor. Feynman, in particular, observed that certain physical systems are so complex that simulating them on a classical computer would be practically impossible. He proposed that quantum computers, machines that obey the same rules as the systems they simulate, could perform such tasks more efficiently. This idea gave birth to a new field of research, one that continues to grow today. Modern quantum computers, though still in their infancy, have demonstrated the potential to solve specific problems, such as factoring large numbers, simulating molecular interactions, or optimizing complex systems, much faster than their classical counterparts. While full-scale, fault-tolerant quantum computers are still under development, the theoretical implications are already profound. But how does this relate to consciousness? The connection begins with the question of whether the human brain might, in some sense, be a quantum computer, or at least utilize quantum computational principles. If true, this could help explain why the brain is capable of feats that seem to outstrip classical computation: rapid pattern recognition, intuitive leaps, emotional depth, creativity, and, perhaps most critically, the experience of subjective awareness. Proponents of this view argue that the brain's computational power cannot be fully captured by classical models. Even the most sophisticated artificial neural networks, built on classical architecture, struggle to replicate the fluidity and richness of human cognition. Could it be that the brain accesses deeper computational resources, ones rooted in the laws of quantum mechanics? This possibility has been explored in depth by scientists like Seth Lloyd, a quantum physicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who has described the universe itself as a kind of quantum computer. In Lloyd's view, every physical process, from the orbits of planets to the firing of neurons, can be seen as a form of computation. The universe is computing its own evolution, moment by moment, using the language of quantum interactions. If this is the case, then perhaps consciousness is not an anomaly but an emergent feature of certain quantum computations. Perhaps systems that reach a particular threshold of complexity, coherence, and integration become not only intelligent but self-aware. David Deutsch, another foundational figure in quantum computing, has taken this line of thought further. Deutsch argues that understanding the mind requires understanding the nature of knowledge, and that knowledge itself is a product of information processing systems capable of conjecture, error correction, and explanation. Quantum computers, by expanding the limits of what can be known and computed, may provide a new framework for thinking about these systems. Still, to propose that the brain performs quantum computation is not the same as proving it. The challenge lies in identifying physical mechanisms within the brain that can support such computation. As discussed earlier, one hypothesis involves microtubules and their potential role in sustaining coherent quantum states. But other possibilities have been considered, including molecular-level interactions, quantum tunneling in ion channels, or entangled states within neural assemblies. These ideas remain speculative, but they invite important questions. What distinguishes a quantum computation from a classical one, not just in technical terms, but in terms of experience? Could the subjective feel of consciousness, the qualia that define each moment of awareness, emerge only from quantum processes? Some theorists believe the answer may lie in the nature of quantum indeterminacy. In classical computation, every step follows deterministically from the last. In quantum systems, by contrast, outcomes are governed by probabilities until measured. This indeterminacy introduces an element of potentiality, multiple futures that coexist until one is actualized. If consciousness is involved in, or even constituted by, this process of collapsing potential into actuality, then it may be intimately linked to quantum computation. Perhaps the conscious mind is not simply processing information, but selecting from among many possible futures, participating in the actualization of one outcome over others. This idea resonates with some interpretations of quantum mechanics that emphasize the role of the observer. In those views, measurement is not just a passive reading of data. It is a kind of interaction that brings definite states into being. If the brain is performing quantum computations, and if consciousness is somehow tied to those computations, then awareness might not just reflect the world, it might help shape it. There is also a more technical aspect to this line of inquiry. In classical computation, errors accumulate over time and must be corrected through redundancy and error-checking protocols. Quantum computation, too, faces challenges from noise and decoherence, but it also offers new methods for error correction based on entangled states and logical qubits. Some researchers have proposed that biological systems might implement analogous strategies, using structural features of proteins or neural networks to preserve coherence and correct for quantum noise. While this remains a theoretical possibility, the search for biological quantum error correction is ongoing. If such mechanisms exist, they would provide strong support for the notion that the brain engages in quantum information processing, perhaps even that it has evolved to do so efficiently. Critics, of course, remain cautious. They point out that quantum computing is still in its early stages, and that claims about quantum computation in the brain are often based on analogy rather than evidence. They emphasize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that the burden remains on researchers to demonstrate that such processes are real, functional, and causally linked to consciousness. Nevertheless, the idea that consciousness might be rooted in quantum computation continues to inspire inquiry across disciplines. It represents a convergence of physics, neuroscience, information theory, and philosophy, a reminder that the mind may not be understood by any single field alone. The ultimate test of this idea will be experimental. Can we identify coherent quantum states in the brain? Can we trace patterns of entanglement or superposition that correlate with mental events? Can we build artificial systems that replicate such patterns? And if so, will they exhibit any form of awareness? Building on the theoretical foundations of quantum consciousness and the tantalizing possibility that the brain might perform quantum computations, the natural question arises, can any of this be tested? For a theory to move from speculation into science, it must generate testable predictions and invite empirical investigation. Over the past 2 decades, a small but determined group of researchers has attempted to do exactly that, bringing experimental techniques to bear on one of the most profound questions in science. Testing quantum processes in biology is already a formidable challenge. Testing them in the brain, an organ of extraordinary complexity, sensitivity, and dynamic activity, is exponentially more difficult. Nonetheless, scientists are increasingly developing methods to detect quantum phenomena in biological environments, and some of the most promising experiments are beginning to target the hypotheses put forward by theories like Orch OR. Perhaps the most direct path to testing quantum consciousness theories lies in the microtubule hypothesis proposed by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose. According to Orch OR, microtubules within neurons support quantum coherence, and the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states gives rise to discrete moments of conscious awareness. If this is true, then microtubules should demonstrate behaviors indicative of quantum processing, and these behaviors should vary in meaningful ways depending on the state of consciousness. One of the first major experimental efforts to test this idea was led by Anirban Bandyopadhyay, a physicist and nanotechnology researcher whose work bridges quantum mechanics, biology, and materials science. Beginning in the early 2000s, Bandyopadhyay and his collaborators began using scanning tunneling microscopy and atomic force microscopy to investigate the electrical properties of microtubules. Their studies, conducted on both purified microtubule samples and within live cells, revealed oscillatory electrical signals at frequencies much higher than those typically observed in neurons, ranging from kilohertz to megahertz and even into the gigahertz range. These signals were coherent, sustained, and appeared to be organized in a fractal-like hierarchy. To many observers, this was unexpected. Conventional neuroscience had not predicted such behavior in microtubules. The findings suggested that microtubules might function as subneuronal oscillators, operating at speeds far beyond the action potentials of neurons and possibly contributing to the synchronization required for conscious experience. Bandyopadhyay also reported evidence of resonant coupling between microtubules, meaning that microtubules could synchronize their oscillations with one another across distances. This kind of long-range coherence is a hallmark of quantum systems. While not direct proof of quantum entanglement or superposition, it supports the idea that microtubules exhibit dynamics more complex than previously assumed. Still, these findings remain controversial. Critics have questioned whether the observed oscillations are truly quantum in nature or whether they can be explained by classical mechanisms such as ionic flows or protein conformational changes. The challenge, as always, lies in isolating quantum signatures, such as entanglement, coherence times, or non-local correlations, within the noisy environment of living tissue. To strengthen the case for quantum brain processes, researchers have begun turning to interdisciplinary tools. Advances in quantum optoelectronics, ultra-fast laser spectroscopy, and nanoelectronic sensors are now being adapted for biological contexts. These technologies allow for the detection of faint, rapid, and high-frequency signals that might otherwise be lost in conventional electrophysiology. There are also efforts underway to test whether external quantum phenomena can interact with biological systems in a way that affects consciousness. For example, one line of research investigates whether exposing neural tissue or microtubules to entangled photons or coherent electromagnetic fields can influence their behavior. Such experiments remain at an early stage, but they represent an attempt to bridge the gap between theory and observation. One particularly intriguing avenue involves anesthetics, which offer a rare opportunity to correlate changes in consciousness with changes in molecular behavior. Anesthetics such as halothane, isoflurane, and propofol are known to reversibly suppress consciousness. Their molecular targets have traditionally been thought to reside in synaptic receptors or ion channels, but some evidence suggests they may also bind directly to tubulin, the protein subunits that form microtubules. Hameroff and others have proposed that anesthetics disrupt consciousness by interfering with quantum coherence in microtubules. If this is the case, then studying how anesthetics affect the vibrational or electrical properties of microtubules could yield critical insights. Recent studies have begun exploring how anesthetics alter microtubule oscillations, but the results remain preliminary and require further replication. In parallel with these biological investigations, researchers are also developing in vitro models, simplified experimental systems that replicate certain features of brain microtubules in controlled conditions. By isolating tubulin proteins or constructing artificial microtubule arrays, scientists can study their properties without the confounding variables of the entire brain. These systems can be cooled to cryogenic temperatures, shielded from noise, or subjected to controlled quantum inputs, enabling more precise measurement. Yet the ultimate goal remains elusive: to demonstrate that quantum coherence in microtubules correlates with and is causally involved in conscious experience. To achieve this, experimentalists must find ways to track brain states during transitions in consciousness, such as falling asleep, waking up, entering anesthesia, or emerging from coma, and correlate these with measurable changes in microtubule dynamics. Some groups have begun using EEG, MEG, and fMRI in conjunction with high-resolution intracellular recordings to explore whether certain brainwave patterns are linked to quantum-scale events. For instance, if specific frequencies of neural oscillation are coupled with microtubule vibrations, this could support the Orch OR prediction that conscious moments occur in discrete, quantized intervals. Other researchers have proposed indirect tests. For example, if consciousness depends on quantum coherence, then it might be susceptible to quantum noise or decoherence-inducing agents in ways that classical processing is not. Experiments that selectively increase environmental noise through temperature changes, electromagnetic fields, or pharmacological interventions could help determine whether quantum fragility affects consciousness in measurable ways. There is also increasing interest in animal models. By comparing brain dynamics in species with varying levels of behavioral complexity, researchers can explore whether quantum signatures are more pronounced in species that exhibit signs of self-awareness, tool use, or metacognition. This comparative approach may help identify which biological features correlate with quantum processing and which do not. Finally, the rise of quantum technologies, including entangled sensors, quantum-enhanced microscopes, and biologically compatible qubit platforms, offers new tools for investigating quantum biology. These instruments may eventually allow for the direct detection of entangled states, coherent transitions, or gravitationally induced collapse within living systems. To be clear, none of these efforts have yet provided definitive proof of quantum consciousness. The field is still in its infancy, and the technical barriers are enormous. But the fact that these experiments are now being designed and carried out marks a significant shift. What was once a purely theoretical question is now a matter of testable science. More importantly, these efforts demonstrate the value of interdisciplinary research. Quantum physicists, neuroscientists, biochemists, and engineers are beginning to collaborate in ways that would have seemed unlikely a generation ago. Together, they are exploring the frontier between matter and mind, between the physical world and the subjective realm of experience. Whether or not quantum consciousness theories are ultimately confirmed, the experiments themselves are likely to yield valuable insights. They may uncover new properties of microtubules, new mechanisms of anesthesia, or new forms of biological computation. And in doing so, they may bring us closer to understanding how the brain creates the mystery of consciousness. Among the many tools scientists have used to study consciousness, few are as intriguing and as revealing as anesthesia. The ability to reliably and reversibly switch off consciousness without causing damage to the brain presents a rare scientific opportunity. It allows researchers to observe what happens when awareness disappears and reappears. In this way, anesthesia becomes more than a medical tool. It becomes a window into the mechanisms that sustain conscious experience. The question is simple yet profound. What does general anesthesia actually do to the brain that results in the loss of consciousness? And equally important, what happens when consciousness returns? These questions are not merely theoretical. Understanding the precise mechanisms of anesthesia is essential to medicine, especially in surgery and intensive care. But they also point to something deeper. If we can identify the biological switches that control conscious states, we may begin to uncover how consciousness itself is generated. For most of modern medical history, the mechanisms by which anesthetics cause unconsciousness were only partially understood. Practitioners knew that agents like ether, chloroform, and later halothane and propofol could render patients unresponsive. But the details of how these substances affected the brain remained largely mysterious. One of the earliest scientific breakthroughs came in the 20th century, when researchers discovered that anesthetics bind to membrane proteins, particularly those involved in synaptic transmission. Many anesthetics enhance the function of GABA-A receptors, which inhibit neuronal firing, leading to a global reduction in brain activity. Others suppress the function of excitatory receptors like NMDA receptors, further reducing communication between neurons. These findings led to the prevailing explanation. Anesthetics impair consciousness by disrupting the normal flow of information between brain regions. Without synchronized activity between the thalamus, cortex, and other higher-order brain structures, the brain loses its ability to integrate information, and consciousness fades. This aligns well with certain theories of consciousness, such as the global neuronal workspace theory, which emphasizes the role of widespread connectivity in sustaining awareness. If anesthetics block this connectivity, then conscious processing cannot occur. But in recent years, new findings have challenged this view, or at least added new layers to it. Researchers have begun to notice that anesthetic molecules may not act solely at the level of the synapse or membrane, but also interact with deeper components of the cell. This has brought renewed attention to microtubules, the intracellular structures that Orch OR theory posits as the quantum substrate of consciousness. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist by training, had long hypothesized that anesthetics act not only by disrupting synaptic signaling, but by binding directly to tubulin, the protein building block of microtubules. According to this hypothesis, anesthetics impair consciousness by disrupting quantum coherence within microtubules. If Orch OR is correct, and quantum events in microtubules give rise to discrete moments of awareness, then interfering with those events should prevent consciousness from occurring, even if classical neural signaling remains partially intact. This idea is still under investigation, but it has led to several testable predictions. One is that different anesthetics should affect microtubules in specific and measurable ways. Another is that consciousness should not return until microtubule dynamics are restored, even if neural connectivity appears normal on the surface. To explore this, researchers have used a combination of imaging techniques, molecular modeling, and electrophysiology. Some studies have shown that anesthetic molecules do in fact bind to hydrophobic pockets within tubulin proteins. This could, in theory, alter the protein's conformational states or affect its ability to engage in coherent oscillations. There is also evidence that anesthetics alter the electrical properties of microtubules, dampening their resonant frequencies. This supports the idea that microtubules are not passive structures, but active components that respond to chemical changes in ways that might affect consciousness. One particularly interesting area of study involves the onset and offset of anesthesia. When a patient loses consciousness, the transition is often abrupt, but not always symmetrical. Waking up from anesthesia can follow a different neurophysiological path than falling into it. Some researchers have compared this to a phase transition in physics, where a small change in input leads to a sudden shift in state. If consciousness is tied to a quantum process, such phase transitions could reflect underlying changes in coherence or entanglement. Electroencephalogram (EEG) recordings taken during anesthesia show distinct patterns, bursts of slow oscillations, periods of suppression, and then eventual reactivation of normal brain rhythms. These changes are consistent with altered integration and communication among brain networks, but they may also reflect deeper changes within cells, such as loss and restoration of microtubule activity. The possibility that anesthesia affects both classical and quantum levels of the brain has led to new kinds of experiments. Some labs are now comparing the effects of different anesthetics, not just in terms of consciousness, but in terms of microtubule resonance, oscillation patterns, and binding affinity. Others are exploring genetically modified tubulin to see whether changes in its molecular structure affect anesthetic sensitivity. Animal models have also proven valuable. Studies in mice and fruit flies have shown that mutations in tubulin can alter an organism's response to anesthesia. While not definitive, this suggests a potential link between microtubule structure and conscious state modulation. Importantly, none of these findings prove that quantum coherence in microtubules causes consciousness, but they open a path to experimentally distinguish between models. If classical theories predict that anesthesia works only at the membrane or network level, and quantum theories predict effects at the subcellular or molecular level, then experiments that reveal microtubule-specific interactions could help resolve the debate. In addition, this line of research could have clinical implications. Understanding how different anesthetics interact with various cellular targets might lead to safer, more effective sedation techniques. It might also improve the management of patients in comas or vegetative states, where consciousness is altered but not eliminated. Perhaps most importantly, anesthesia offers a controlled, repeatable setting in which consciousness can be studied across transitions. Unlike sleep or trauma, which are more variable, general anesthesia allows for precise manipulation of brain state. This makes it an ideal model system, not just for testing theories, but for mapping the boundary between conscious and unconscious brain function. As the tools of neuroscience become more refined and as quantum biology gains experimental traction, the study of anesthesia may offer the clearest window yet into how consciousness arises, how it can be disrupted, and how it might be restored. Whether the answer lies in synaptic activity, subcellular structures, or quantum computation, anesthesia gives us a rare glimpse into the mechanics of awareness, and it raises a deeper philosophical question. What does it mean that consciousness can be turned off with such ease? If awareness is so delicately balanced that a few molecules can remove it, does this suggest fragility or a kind of finely tuned precision? And what exactly is shutting down when we lose consciousness? To pursue this further, we must widen our view beyond biology and neuroscience and explore the deeper philosophical implications. If consciousness can be interrupted chemically, and if its presence or absence depends on internal processes, classical or quantum, then what role, if any, does consciousness play in the universe at large? If consciousness can be so delicately switched off and on by anesthetic molecules, by brain injury, or by natural fluctuations in neural dynamics, then we are left with a compelling puzzle. What exactly is consciousness, and why should it arise at all from arrangements of matter? This question has fueled not only neuroscientific and physical theories, but also philosophical debates that stretch back centuries. And increasingly, some thinkers are revisiting one of the most ancient and provocative ideas of all, that consciousness might not be a late emerging feature of complex brains, but a fundamental property of the universe itself. This view is known as Panpsychism. It proposes that some form of consciousness, however minimal, is present in all physical systems, not just in humans or animals, but in all matter. Panpsychism does not claim that electrons think or that rocks dream, but rather that the building blocks of the universe possess proto-conscious qualities, rudimentary elements of experience that, when combined and integrated in the right ways, give rise to full-fledged awareness. For centuries, panpsychism was a marginal idea. In the age of mechanistic science, where physical systems were understood in terms of blind, deterministic forces, there seemed little reason to suppose that consciousness had anything to do with atoms or energy fields. Matter was inert, consciousness was rare, and the two were considered categorically different. But this hard division created problems. Chief among them was the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from purely objective processes? How does a configuration of neurons, however complex, produce the feeling of pain, the color red, or the sense of self? This explanatory gap has remained stubbornly wide, despite enormous progress in mapping the brain. Panpsychism offers a radical solution to the hard problem. Consciousness does not arise from matter because matter already contains the seeds of consciousness. If the basic constituents of the universe have both physical and experiential aspects, then consciousness does not need to be created. It merely needs to be arranged in the right configuration. One of the leading contemporary advocates of this view is Galen Strawson, a British philosopher who argues that physicalism, the idea that everything is physical, does not require the denial of consciousness in the fabric of nature. In fact, Strawson suggests that to be a consistent physicalist, one must accept that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the physical world. As he puts it, experience is just what matter does. Another prominent voice is Philip Goff, who has written extensively on the subject in both academic and public forums. Goff suggests that panpsychism is not only metaphysically elegant, but empirically promising. By placing consciousness at the base level of reality, rather than at the top of an evolutionary ladder, it provides a framework for explaining how subjective experience can exist in a universe otherwise described by impersonal laws. Goff also links panpsychism to quantum mechanics, pointing out that quantum theory already challenges our intuitive picture of matter. In quantum physics, particles are not tiny billiard balls, but probabilistic entities that exist in multiple states, lack definite positions until measured, and display non-local correlations. These are not the hallmarks of classical objectivity. If matter is this strange, this participatory, then perhaps it is not so far-fetched to suppose that it contains something akin to experience. Indeed, quantum mechanics has long been associated with the role of the observer. As we explored earlier, the act of measurement in quantum theory appears to collapse a system from a superposition of possibilities into a definite state. Some interpretations suggest that observation itself is what brings about this collapse. While mainstream physics does not claim that human consciousness is necessary for measurement, the question of what constitutes an observer remains unresolved. This ambiguity has led some theorists to speculate that consciousness and quantum reality are intertwined, not merely through biological systems like the brain, but at a fundamental level. The late physicist John Archibald Wheeler proposed the idea of the participatory universe, where observers play an active role in shaping physical reality. Wheeler suggested that the universe requires observation in order to be fully realized, and that we, conscious beings, are part of the mechanism by which the cosmos gives rise to itself. His famous aphorism, "it from bit," captures this view, that all things, particles, forces, fields, arise from acts of informational distinction, from the answering of yes or no questions. Some have interpreted this to mean that consciousness and information are deeply connected, and that what we call reality is the sum of countless acts of observational participation. If panpsychism is correct, then consciousness is not just a byproduct of evolution, it is the lens through which the universe knows itself. This perspective has enormous implications. It suggests that the difference between conscious and non-conscious systems is not that one possesses experience and the other does not, but rather that consciousness in the latter is too fragmented, too diffuse, or too minimally integrated to produce awareness in any familiar form. From this view, consciousness becomes a spectrum, not a threshold. A bacterium might possess a flicker of awareness, a primitive sensitivity to its environment. A tree might have a diffuse, non-centralized form of sentience. A human brain, with its vast network of integrated systems, might create a rich tapestry of self-reflective consciousness. Quantum physics may play a role in this continuum. If coherence, entanglement, or other non-classical phenomena contribute to integration, then quantum effects could amplify or organize the proto-conscious aspects of matter into structured awareness. This would provide a natural bridge between panpsychism and quantum theories of mind. Some scientists, like Henry Stapp, have argued for this convergence explicitly. Stapp, a theoretical physicist who worked closely with pioneers of quantum mechanics, proposed that consciousness and quantum events are deeply entangled, each influencing the other in a feedback loop that shapes both the observer and the observed. In this model, consciousness is not just a passive witness to reality, it is an active participant in the ongoing evolution of the universe. And if consciousness is built into the very structure of matter, then even the simplest interactions carry within them the faint trace of awareness. Of course, this view is controversial. Critics argue that panpsychism risks explaining too much and too little at the same time. If everything is conscious, then the term loses its explanatory power. And if proto-consciousness is not measurable, then how can the theory be tested or falsified? Others worry that panpsychism veers too close to metaphysics, straying from the empirical rigor that characterizes modern science. They argue that while the mystery of consciousness is real, the answer must come from within biology and neuroscience, not from reassigning consciousness to every atom and particle in the universe. Yet defenders of panpsychism counter that its strength lies in its conceptual coherence. Rather than attempting to conjure experience from non-experiential matter, it treats consciousness as an intrinsic property, one that evolves in complexity but does not appear from nothing. And if the science of the 20th and 21st centuries has taught us anything, it is that reality often defies intuition. After all, quantum mechanics itself was once considered absurd. The notion that particles could exist in multiple places at once, or that measuring one particle could instantaneously affect another across vast distances, was unthinkable to classical physicists. But nature, it seems, does not conform to our expectations. In this spirit, panpsychism asks us to entertain a different kind of cosmos, one in which consciousness is not an exception to the rules of physics, but a foundational element woven into the fabric of space, time, and matter. As panpsychism reopens the door to the idea that consciousness might be fundamental to reality, it raises an even broader and more ambitious question. Could our understanding of consciousness shape the future of physics itself? For centuries, physics has advanced by searching for deeper laws, unifying disparate forces, revealing hidden symmetries, and expanding our grasp of the universe's structure. But as we now confront the unresolved tensions between quantum mechanics and general relativity, some theorists believe we may be missing a key piece of the puzzle. That missing piece, they suggest, could be consciousness. This is not a casual or mystical claim. It arises from a deep recognition of physics' current limitations that have persisted despite decades of brilliant work. Quantum mechanics, though extraordinarily successful at predicting particle behavior, remains silent on gravity. General relativity, which describes gravity as the curvature of space-time, breaks down at the quantum scale. Despite numerous efforts, a full theory of quantum gravity, one that unites the very small with the very large, has proven elusive. Some researchers now believe that solving this puzzle may require a shift in perspective. Instead of treating consciousness as an epiphenomenon of neural activity, or worse, ignoring it altogether, perhaps we must acknowledge that consciousness is a real and active component of physical systems. That to formulate a truly complete theory of the universe, the observer must be included not just as a passive bystander, but as a participant in the structure of reality. One of the earliest voices to articulate this idea was John Archibald Wheeler, the theoretical physicist who coined the term black hole and contributed significantly to both quantum theory and general relativity. In the latter part of his career, Wheeler began to propose that the universe was fundamentally participatory, that reality is not fully real until it is observed. His famous phrase, "The universe does not exist out there, independent of us," encapsulated this provocative view. Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle suggested that observers are not just incidental features of the cosmos, but necessary for its existence in its present form. While his views were speculative, they were grounded in the logic of quantum mechanics and cosmology. If the laws of physics are such that conscious observers inevitably arise, and if observation plays a role in defining what is real, then consciousness may be woven into the very fabric of physical law. This line of reasoning has been taken further by modern theorists who see consciousness as the bridge between information and physical structure. In quantum mechanics, the role of information is already central. The state of a system is described not by tangible particles, but by a wave function, a mathematical object that encodes probabilities, possibilities, and correlations. This wave function collapses upon observation, producing a definite outcome from a cloud of uncertainty. But what exactly constitutes an observation? Is it simply any interaction that records a result, or does it require a conscious witness? Most mainstream interpretations avoid invoking the mind directly, yet the boundary between measurement and consciousness remains blurred. Some researchers, including physicists working on quantum foundations, have begun to speculate that consciousness and information may be two sides of the same coin, that the observer effect is not an oddity to be brushed aside, but a clue to something deeper, that subjective experience is bound up with the way reality unfolds. One proposal along these lines is observer-centric physics, which posits that any comprehensive theory of the universe must be formulated from the perspective of an observer, not an external God's eye view, but a view from within the system. This shift in vantage point aligns with relativity, where the laws of physics are expressed relative to a given frame of reference. It also resonates with quantum mechanics, where different observers may describe the same system in different ways, depending on what they measure and when. This idea is reflected in cutting-edge work on the holographic principle, black hole entropy, and the ADS-CFT correspondence, all of which place a premium on the flow and structure of information. In these theories, space and time themselves may emerge from patterns of entanglement, non-local correlations between quantum bits of information. If consciousness, too, is a manifestation of informational integration, then perhaps it is not just a feature of minds, but a window into the informational structure of space-time itself. This possibility gains further support from physicist Carlo Rovelli's work on relational quantum mechanics, which argues that physical properties do not exist in absolute terms, but only relative to other systems. In this view, reality is a web of relationships, not a collection of standalone objects. Measurement is not about revealing pre-existing facts, but about establishing connections. Consciousness, as a deeply relational phenomenon, might be fundamental in this web. At the same time, physicists working on loop quantum gravity and string theory continue to explore how quantum spacetime might be structured. These efforts often focus on mathematical consistency and predictive power, but as the equations grow more intricate, some researchers worry that we are missing something essential, something not easily captured by equations alone. This concern has led to renewed interest in phenomenology, the philosophical study of experience itself. If consciousness is not fully captured by objections, objective description, then perhaps it points to a level of reality that is subjective but real and which must be integrated into the physics of the future. The implications are staggering. If consciousness is fundamental, then our standard model of physics is incomplete. We cannot fully understand particles, fields, or forces without also understanding awareness. This would mark a radical departure from centuries of scientific tradition, which has treated the subjective as secondary to the objective. And yet, this shift might be necessary. Every scientific revolution, from Copernicus to Newton, from Einstein to Bohr, has required a change in perspective. Perhaps the next revolution will involve turning the lens inward and recognizing that the mind is not just a product of the universe, but also a key to understanding it. This is not to suggest that physics must abandon its mathematical rigor. Rather, it must expand its scope. As researchers begin to probe the nature of consciousness experimentally through studies of anesthesia, neural dynamics, quantum biology, and even artificial intelligence, they are gathering data that may one day inform new physical principles. Some theorists, such as Donald Hoffman, have gone so far as to propose that space and time are not fundamental at all, but emergent from patterns of conscious perception. In this radical view, consciousness is primary, and the physical world is a user interface, a way for minds to interact without being overwhelmed by the complexity of reality. While highly speculative, these ideas share a common thread, that consciousness may be indispensable to the deepest questions of existence. Whether as a generator of information, a selector of outcomes, or a participant in cosmic unfolding, the mind may be as basic to the universe as energy or mass. What does this mean for the future of physics? It suggests that any attempt to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity may need to include a theory of consciousness, that the theory of everything may not be complete until it explains not only how matter behaves, but why experience arises. That physics, long devoted to what can be measured, must now also engage with the mystery of the one who measures. This is not a rejection of science, it is an evolution of it. Just as classical mechanics gave way to relativity and quantum theory, so too might current paradigms evolve to embrace the study of consciousness as a physical phenomenon, grounded not only in biology, but in the very logic of the cosmos. Having followed consciousness across the worlds of neuroscience, quantum mechanics, biology, and philosophy, we now find ourselves standing at the edge of knowledge, where evidence, theory, and wonder converge. The central question that guided us, is consciousness a quantum mystery, remains open yet far more enriched. We began with a mystery, and we end not with a definitive answer, but with a deeper appreciation of its complexity and significance. Consciousness, as we have seen, is unlike any other phenomenon in science. It is not merely another biological function like digestion or respiration. It is the very medium through which all scientific inquiry takes place. We do not just study consciousness, we study through it. All observations, all experiments, all reflections arise within the field of subjective experience. This makes consciousness both the most familiar and the most elusive subject of all. In classical neuroscience, consciousness is often framed as an emergent product of the brain, an outcome of complex electrochemical activity within neural networks. This view has led to impressive insights into how the brain processes information, coordinates behavior, and supports cognition. Yet it has not explained why experience exists at all. The functional explanations fall short of illuminating the qualitative texture of awareness, the fact that there is something it is like to be conscious. Quantum theories of consciousness attempt to fill this gap, proposing that subjective experience may arise from the indeterminate, probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics. Theories such as Orch OR suggest that quantum coherence, collapse, and entanglement within microtubules could generate the unity and subjectivity of consciousness. While the empirical evidence remains inconclusive, the very act of exploring this possibility has pushed science into new territory, challenging assumptions and expanding the boundaries of what is considered testable. Integrated information theory offers a contrasting vision, one that treats consciousness as a property of informational structure rather than of quantum mechanics. In this model, what matters is how information is integrated, not how particles behave at the quantum level. This has led to new ways of quantifying consciousness and exploring its presence across a wide range of biological and artificial systems. And then there is the philosophical resurgence of Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness may be woven into the fabric of reality itself, not emerging from complexity, but manifesting through it. This perspective aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that emphasize the role of the observer, and with theories that treat information as more fundamental than matter. Across these diverse views, one thing is clear: consciousness challenges the separation between subject and object, mind and matter, science and philosophy. It resists the tidy boundaries that define other scientific problems. This is not a weakness. It is a signal that consciousness may require a new kind of scientific framework, one that is not afraid to blend disciplines or rethink foundational assumptions. We have seen that experiments are now beginning to probe the hypotheses once confined to speculation. Microtubules, once thought to be merely structural, are being examined as potential information processors. Quantum coherence, long believed incompatible with biology, is now observed in photosynthesis and bird navigation. Anesthetics, sleep, and altered states are being used to map the fading and return of awareness. These efforts do not yet resolve the quantum question, but they suggest it is at least scientifically accessible. At the same time, the criticism remains strong and necessary. Quantum effects in biology do not prove that consciousness is quantum. The brain's complexity might be explained by classical processes we do not yet fully understand. The hard problem may turn out to be a false problem, an artifact of how we frame the issue rather than an indication of missing physics. In this tension between theory and skepticism, hope and doubt, we find the true nature of scientific progress. Consciousness is not the first mystery to defy explanation. Gravity was once seen as a mysterious force acting at a distance. Light baffled physicists for centuries. Quantum mechanics itself arose from a crisis in classical physics, a set of paradoxes that pointed to the need for a new framework. Perhaps consciousness is leading us into a similar revolution. If so, it may not be a revolution of answers, but of perspective. The path forward will likely involve not a single theory that solves consciousness, but a constellation of insights, biological, physical, computational, and phenomenological, that together reshape our understanding of what it means to be a mind in a material world. There is also a moral and existential dimension to this inquiry. How we understand consciousness affects how we treat other beings, animals, other humans, even future machines. If consciousness is widespread in nature, then the ethical landscape expands. If it can be engineered, then the responsibilities of creation deepen. And if it is fundamental, then every interaction with the world becomes, in some sense, an encounter with awareness. In the end, the question, is consciousness a quantum mystery, may give way to a deeper one. What kind of mystery is consciousness? Is it the kind that will yield to further measurement and modeling? Or is it a doorway to a more expansive understanding of reality, one that transcends the traditional categories of matter, mind, and mathematics? We may not yet know the full answer, but what we do know is this: the pursuit of that answer is one of the most profound journeys science can take. It invites us to explore not only the outer reaches of physics and the inner architecture of the brain, but the very act of awareness itself, the knowing that knows, the question that questions, the presence that perceives. And so the search continues, not just for particles or principles, but for meaning, not just for theories, but for understanding, and not just for knowledge, but for insight into what it means to be conscious in a universe that somehow knows itself.